Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Amanda, and I'm coming to you live from the Aquarium of the Pacific, where I am going to invite you to join me virtually as we explore the world of invertebrates. Now, I also have a little bit of help here on the other side of the camera and controlling all the things you're going to be seeing behind me. My friend Miss Tiffany is here, and she'll be also helping relay information to me that you text in, because we're going to be making observations together, and I would love to hear what you're noticing and what we can figure out together about invertebrates and how unique and special they are, and looking at some of their adaptations. And so if you'd like to participate along with us and share your observations, please contact us at texting us at 562-286-1838. And if you're watching this at a later time after this program has aired live, you are welcome to text in any questions or observations that you make at live@lbaop.org, and we will be happy to respond to you when we get a chance. So let's dive right in. Now, of course, I'm standing in front of some pretty unusual invertebrates now. Now, you may have heard that word before, and if you've watched any of our programs before, you probably are familiar with them. But I would like to start off by asking you, how many of you out there think you know what the word invertebrate might mean? What is an invertebrate? I'm going to go ahead and pause for a moment, and I'm going to let you think about that and give you a chance to text in to that number. Maybe we can put it on the screen again if you didn't write it down the first time. So that number is 562-286-1838. So if you have some ideas of what an invertebrate is, go ahead and let us know. Now, of course, I have some invertebrates on the screen right now, so that might be giving you a hint of what type of animal. This is an example of an animal that's an invertebrate. But not all invertebrates look like this. There are different kinds. But what is an invertebrate? What makes something an invertebrate? And then also think about, are we invertebrates? Because all living things are classified and put together in groups. Scientists put them together in different ways based on characteristics that are the same between them. And so we'll be looking at some of those and kind of trying to figure out how closely related some of these animals are. So have you come up with any ideas yet, maybe as you're watching these animals swim by? First of all, what kinds of animals are these right here? What kind of invertebrates are we looking at?
It's something that doesn't have a backbone.
Oh, who was it that told us that? You are absolutely right, because Lily shared that it is an animal that doesn't have a backbone. And that's exactly what an invertebrate is. So good job, Lily. Thanks for sharing that answer with us. And this is a perfect example, because if you look really carefully, can you see any bones in this animal? No bones whatsoever. So these are, actually, did anyone happen to say what kinds of animals these are? They might not have typed that in. I don't think I asked very clearly. Oh, Jeremiah said that these are jellyfish. You're right. And Maddie answered the question that we are not invertebrates. So good job. You are all correct. So far, we've had 3 wonderful responses that have been spot on. So I knew I was talking to some people who already knew a little bit about this. So we're not going to spend too much time talking about it, but we'll just introduce this topic. Say, yes, invertebrates are animals that have no backbones. And yes, we are not invertebrates. Or I should say, no, we're not invertebrates. We are vertebrates. So if you were to take off the IN in front of that, we are vertebrates because we have vertebrae. So any animal that has a backbone has vertebrae, and we call them vertebrates. But an animal with no backbones and no vertebrae, or you might call it a spine, they are invertebrates. And we can see very clearly as we look, there's a great close-up view of this jelly right here, that it has no bones and is indeed an invertebrate. And you're absolutely right in calling them, you say, oh, the jellyfish. Well, jellyfish, we don't call them jellyfish here. We call them sea jellies, just so that we don't confuse people by the part fish. So when you say jellyfish, that makes me think it's a fish. But these are not fish in the water. Do you see any fins on them? No. In fact, they don't even have vertebrae. So fish actually have backbones, and they're considered vertebrates. So just because these animals don't have any bones, and because they are invertebrates, that's the only reason why you might hear a scientist call them sea jellies rather than jellyfish. But they are indeed the same animal. So good job for knowing that. So sea jellies are a type of invertebrate, but I'm wondering if anyone else can think of some other examples. What are some other examples of the animals, specifically in the ocean? We'll talk about ocean animals that don't have any backbone. Can you think of any other ones? I'll give you a moment to kind of think about it, typing your answers. And if this is a school class, we would love to have the teacher respond to this for us. And at the end, if you could tell us how many students you have, we would really appreciate that. So we have an idea of how many students we're reaching today. Hopefully you're all getting excited about a break coming up. We have a fun holiday coming up. And maybe this is your last day before you have some time off. But what's the biggest invertebrate, somebody asked? Ooh, that's a really good question. Well, it's kind of, we can think about it in a few different ways. First of all, these right here, these jellies, some of them get very, very large. And the largest of all of these types of jellies right here are lion's mane sea jellies. They can be like this big. They can be really, really wide. So that round part of them, their bell, can be way bigger than me. And they can have tentacles that reach 100 feet long. Now, that's a sea jelly. If you're thinking about a giant, well, actually it's part of the name, a giant squid. A giant squid is really long. They could maybe get up to 60 feet long even, maybe. And so those are really, really, really big. But if you think about some individual invertebrates like corals, corals actually grow together in this big colony and they create a big coral reef. And coral reefs can be seen even from outer space. And so if you think about it that way, the coral reef is probably the largest invertebrate, even though the individual coral animals are quite small. But I'd say probably the giant squid is the biggest one, or the colossal squid. I don't know, is the colossal squid as long as the giant squid? I'm not sure. But one of those would be the largest one. So thanks for that question. And then, okay, so, some other examples were coming in. So we have squid. Lilia said squid, Maddie said octopus, Jeremiah said clams. Jeremiah, have you thought about giant clams? Is that what you were thinking of? Yes, you might be surprised at how big some clams can get. Now, maybe not quite as big as me, but they do get very large. But I'm glad you brought up clams, because I want you to think about some of the adaptations that these invertebrates have. So invertebrates don't have any backbones. And now would we be able to survive without a backbone? In fact, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. I'm going to ask everyone to stand up right where you are, whether you're at home, in your living room. Well, maybe not if you're in a car. That would not be safe. So if you're watching this in a car, don't do this. But if your teacher gives you permission in your classroom, I'm going to ask you to stand up to next to your desk. And I want you to stand up straight and tall. And the reason you're able to do that is because you have a backbone that is helping you to stand tall like that, or at least sit up straight. But I want you to think now what would happen if you didn't have your vertebrae. If you didn't have your spine, can you go ahead, on the count of 3, I want you to all act like you don't have a spine. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. You probably be this big old blob all over the floor. Are you a big blob on the floor right now? Well, clean yourself up. But we would not be able to survive. Now stand up straight and tall again. Give yourself a backbone. All right, so now you are a vertebrate again. But I want you to imagine how difficult life would be for us if we didn't have a backbone. We wouldn't be able to stand up tall. We wouldn't be able to walk well. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of things without our bones. We would not survive. Our bones are important. They keep the inside parts of us protected. But these animals that don't have backbones have other things called adaptations, which are things that help animals to survive in their habitat, that help them to survive in their habitat. That makes sense. So think about some of these invertebrates we've talked about, the squid, octopus, and clams. Can you think of anything special about their body that might help those animals to survive? Or maybe you're thinking of another invertebrate. why don't you go ahead and text in an invertebrate that you're thinking about and something that they have on their body that helps them to survive. In fact, I like Jeremiah's example of clams. While you're thinking about that, I'm going to show you a picture of some, well, let's see if we can find an example of a clam. Yes, I have one right here. So if you can see my screen, here's a shell of a clam. Now, I want you to think about it for a little bit. In fact, maybe I'll take it over here in front of my screen too so you can see just how big this is in comparison to me. This is just a regular clam shell. It's not a giant clam like you were talking about. But how does an animal survive? I don't even think about a clam being an animal a lot of times. A lot of times we just think about the shell. I wonder what a clam really is. What kind of animal is a clam? Is this the whole animal right here? Is this what they look like all the time? Maybe you've seen this and you thought, oh, I thought that was just a shell. But did you ever think about where the shells come from? How important is the shell to this animal? And why is the shell so important? I want you to be thinking about some of those things. And go ahead and text in any thoughts you might have, because we would love to hear what your thoughts are on this animal that I'm holding right now. Because I said it's part of a clam, but it's only part of it. It's not the whole thing. What would it look like if this isn't the whole thing? Any idea? Well, as you're thinking about that, I'm going to put that back over there. So you can think about invertebrates a little bit more. Think about some of your favorite ones. Think about adaptations they have. What helps them survive? What helped that clam to survive? Well, obviously that clam isn't alive now, but it did grow to be a pretty big size. It got this big. But what did it look like? A clam, the shell itself doesn't just walk around on its own. How does a clam move? How is it an animal? Where is the part that looks like an animal?
We got a question. Can you tell how old the clam is by the shell?
Oh, we had a question about can you tell how old a clam is by its shell? Yes and no. Now, I can't tell you a specific age, but let's go ahead and examine this a little bit more. I'm going to move some of my other out of the way. And let me turn the light on, hopefully, so we can see it a little bit better. Oh, hold on. My lighting, there we go. Oops. Well, I'd like to make it brighter. I'm having a hard time making it brighter.
So we have some texted exoskeletons and some can camouflage.
Oh, and I love some of the comments that are coming in. So people were talking about having an exoskeleton and having camouflage. Those are all wonderful adaptations that lots of invertebrates have. Now, this particular, we'll talk about an exoskeleton in just a little bit. But since we started talking about this clam and we were talking about the age of it, I want to point out a couple things. This is not considered an exoskeleton. This is a shell. And the shell, if you look at it, do you see how they have these kind of lines in them? Now, I don't want you to think that, oh, well, every time it's a line, it's a year of life, like a tree, because you know that if you cut a tree and you look at the inside of the tree trunk, if you count the rings, you can count how old, the number of years that tree is. Well, clamshells come in a similar way, but not specifically to but we can see them growing because these are indeed sort of growth rings. When this clam started off life, it actually started really small, and it started from this area right here. And then they grow their shell and make their shell bigger and bigger, and they add onto it layer by layer as they grow. So remember, this shell, this is only one shell. Clams have how many shells? You can shout it out. That's right. I think I heard some of you through here. They have 2 shells, so there would normally be another half to this clam, and the animal lives inside of it. So in this place right here. And in fact, it looks like there's even certain parts of this shell, I don't know how well you can see it though, that actually are places where the muscle would attach. So the animal can help close its shell and hide inside of it. And it all lives right inside. So The shell, though, is also part of the animal. So the animal actually builds its shell as it grows, and it keeps adding on to the outside. Now, you can also see that in this other shell that I have here. This is not, well, actually, I guess it's a little bit hard to see on this one, but this is a shell of a different type of animal. In fact, you might notice some things about it. What's kind of different about this shell compared to the clam shell that we were looking at before? So they're both shells, but this one is really unusual. And in fact, let me flip it over to the other side, because I'm kind of curious if anyone has any idea what kind of shell, what kind of animal this came from. It came from another invertebrate, and invertebrates that have these hard shells like this, that have these hard shells that they live under, we actually call mollusks. So mollusks are hard-shelled, soft-bodied animals, so they rely on that shell to keep their soft body safe inside. But unlike the clam shell that had two shells, so we call it a bivalve, because think about bi means two. So not like buying groceries at the store, but bi as in a bicycle. How many wheels are on a bicycle? 2. Well, how many shells are on a clam? 2. So it's a bivalve. There's 2 parts of it. This one right here would be what we call a univalve. And what is a unicycle? Have you ever heard of a unicycle before? Okay, maybe you have, maybe you haven't. A unicycle, if a bicycle has 2 wheels, a unicycle has 1 wheel. So if this is a univalve, that means this animal has just 1 shell. And so the soft-bodied part of this animal lives underneath this 1 shell. It doesn't have another one on the other side of it, and so it actually lives underneath it like that. And here's a picture of this animal. If any of you are kind of wondering, you might think that doesn't look like an animal, it looks like a crazy rock. But this animal lives underneath the shell, and if you look right here around the edges, you can see this sort of black sort of border around it. Well, that is part of the foot kind of sticking out, because this is a type of a snail, a very special type of a snail, that moves around on its belly. Imagine just lying on your belly. I'm not going to get you all on the floor on your belly, because you probably get really dirty. But they move on their belly. It's kind of like they're moving on their stomachs, stomach-footed. So that's what we call these. These are a type of gastropod. Gastro meaning stomach, and pod meaning foot. So it's like their stomach foot. They move around on their stomach, their big stomach foot. And this one right here, oh, and Lilia noticed the holes. I'm so glad you made that observation, Lilia, because that's how we identify this type of animal as being what it is. In fact, let me go back to this. Let me grab this shell right here. So did you all notice these holes right here? So this one has 3 holes that you can see right through. So there's 3 holes that go along the edge. But if we were to look even more carefully, more closely, we'd see that they have these other little bumps where they used to have holes but have since been filled in. Now, how do they fill these in? Well, this is what we call an abalone. Have you heard that word before? Have you heard of abalone? Well, maybe you haven't. Maybe it sounds like bologna, a bologna sandwich. I'm not talking about a meat. This abalone is an animal that likes to live at the bottom of the ocean. You can see the type of habitat it's in. What do you notice around it? Oh, here's another great picture of a younger one. Now, this one is actually a very special kind of abalone. This one, do you notice? This is a lot lighter. We can see it better here. But look at this outside area right here. Do you see that? All these kind of like little things kind of sticking out. We call those sensory tentacles. So they have these little tentacles like sticking out. Now, this one is dark. This one has black. This one has white. We're actually looking at 2 different kinds of abalone. This one is called a red abalone. Red abalone have black parapodia around them. And then this is a white abalone because it has white little sensory tentacles on them. And so what are they holding on to? How are they moving? Well, we said they have that stomach foot. And they're holding on to rocks. So these live on the bottom of the ocean. We don't see these swimming around like fish. But we also don't see them sitting upright in shells like this. They're not clams that are going to open up this way. They just are constantly moving on the bottom. But do you kind of see the rings that we were talking about before? Like when we were talking about the clams, and as they grow, they start off really small, and then they just keep adding on to their shell. They do it on the outside edge of the shell, and we call that, they have a mantle that they use that secretes this sort of shell for them. And so as this animal starts off life, it's really, really tiny, and it would be like right up in this area. And then as they grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And remember, when they're small, they still need to have these little holes. Oh, but why? Why does an animal need small little holes? How do you think these holes might be used by the animals? Do you have any ideas? I want you to think about it. Why might this animal want holes in its shell? What would be the purpose of having holes in the shell of an animal? So think about that. Now, also there's a question about what does it eat. So abalone, what they eat, that's a great question. In fact, look at the things that are around it. What do you notice? Do you see anything that an abalone might be able to eat in this picture? Because usually where an animal lives, its habitat, if you look around it, you'll probably see things in the habitat that will give it its food. What was that, Tiffany? Oh, okay, so we have some great ideas coming in. So they said as far as the holes go, maybe it's for breathing, or maybe it's for filtration. I love those ideas. Are there any other ideas? Because you're right, they do use these holes for breathing. And you're right, they do kind of use it for filtering too. Oh, and someone asked, do they eat through the holes? Because, of course, we have holes in our head, or we have a big hole in our head that we use for helping us eat. So those are great ideas. Now, I will tell you that they don't actually use the holes so much for the food coming into their body, but they do use it for the food coming out of their body, if you get my idea. So these animals have a mouth. They have a head. Now, it's kind of hard to see where's the head of this animal, but the head is going to be up here at the front, up by where the biggest hole is. And so you said for breathing, you're right, they are going to use them for breathing. They're going to have gills, just like fish have, on the underside of these holes. And so these holes are a pathway for them to be able to breathe and bring water in through their gills. And so they can breathe through their holes, that's right. But their mouth is going to be on the underside of the shell. And did you see any evidence for what they might be eating here? They love to eat things like seaweed and algae, things that are growing on the rocks, the algae on the rocks, and even kelp like this. So we have some kelp as a type of a giant seaweed. And so giant kelp, type of seaweed, can be eaten by these animals as well. So we like to feed our abalone some kelp sometimes, and it's really fun to watch them eat. They have this little mouth on the underside, and they can just kind of crank in and scrape up that algae and the stuff that's on the rocks. So, okay, so great questions. Now, we said, or great observations about them eating and breathing through the holes, and we also said the food can come out of it. So yeah, when they're all done eating and they have to go to the bathroom, it comes right out of those holes again. Isn't that crazy? So they use these holes for breathing and also for going to the bathroom. And then you know what? When they're ready to have babies, all the legs and things can come out of the holes too. Isn't that crazy? So those holes are really important for the abalone. But here's the really neat thing. If you ever see an abalone shell, look really closely at where the open holes are, but then also look right behind that, because you'll see these little bumps that have now been filled in. Because as the abalone grows, it's only the outside holes. In fact, you'll even start to see a little bit of an edge right here. Do you see that funny edge on this abalone? If this abalone shell and this abalone was to keep on growing, this would have turned into a new hole on their shell. And then you know what would happen to this one? They would fill it in. So abalone have between 3 and 5 open holes, but all the other old ones get filled in as they grow. So you can kind of see the pattern and the path for how this animal has grown over time. And it's really fun to look for that on other shells. In fact, let's go ahead and look at a few other shells that I have over here, because these all came from different types of invertebrates, different types of, well, some of them are mollusks, some are not. I'll zoom out a little bit so we can see some more. But this one right here, we'll put this in the middle. Does anyone have an idea what kind of animal this one might be? Now, we were looking at a clam earlier. Maybe if we put them side by side, we'll see if there's anything that we notice that's the same or different about these two things. What do you notice? Anything that's the same or different about them? Oh, I don't want to cover it up. I think these things are so beautiful because we have another shell, but look at the differences. Well, the similarities are that they're both hard. They both feel about the same if you were to handle them. They're a similar size. This one might be a little bit bigger. But do you see any sort of rings on their body? Or rings like this? See how we had the lines here? Do you notice lines on this one? Yeah, it almost looks like these lines are kind of going this way, though. Remember, the lines on this one were going this way. Well, do you think this is a clam? Now, maybe you thought it was. Maybe you thought, yeah, that's a clam. Oh, someone guessed oyster. You're onto something because not every animal with a hard shell is a clam. Some are oysters. And I actually don't have an example of an oyster shell, or maybe I do. I don't think that I do. But I do love that you brought that up because oysters are very similar. They also are a bivalve, just like this other one is, which means they have two shells. But that's a good guess. But this one's not an oyster. This is one that I'd say most parents don't even realize what this animal is. In fact, a lot of people will eat these animals and they don't know what it is that they're eating. But this type of mollusk is called a scallop. Have you ever heard of a scallop before? Maybe some of you have said, oh yeah, I think, or maybe the teachers are like, I've eaten scallops. Well, this is what a scallop looks like. A scallop has lines that go out like this, almost like the rays of your hand, or like the sunshine going out. And you also see the ridges, so they have ridges on their shell. It kind of goes up and down and up and down. You can see it on the corner edge, like it's kind of bumpy. So those rays coming out tell you it's a scallop. Whereas the rings on a clam shell go like this and around it. So this animal is a scallop, and they also have these things called little ears on the bottom. No, they don't actually hear out of them. But these little things on the bottom, they look like little kind of ears sticking out. That helps you notice that part of the scallop as well, where it's not quite as obvious on this clam that they have something like that. But again, they do have two shells normally, and they live inside of it. But this shell, you can also see these areas of where as they've gone over time, they do grow out. So it's not just like it's really skinny and is growing out this way. They still look like this, just a smaller version, but they start way down here, and they do grow out, but then they also get these ridges that go the other way. So if you ever see a shell like this, and scallops usually have beautiful colors too, you'll know what they look like. And I'll turn it over on the other side so you can see what they look like on the inside as well. So again, you can see some of those bumps. Now, another animal shell is this one. Ooh, this one is a little bit different. What do you notice about this one? Oh, and we've only got 2 minutes left. We didn't even get to talk about some of my other favorite invertebrates, but I love exploring shells because there's so much you can learn about them because we don't normally think about them as being animals, but they're just part of the body of these amazing invertebrates. So this one, what shape would you call this? This animal right here has a shell that's always the same shape. What kind of shape is this? And then also that same shape right in the middle. It's kind of hard to miss that hole. And that is always there on this animal too. And I want you to think about why they might have that hole. Think about why the abalone had the hole. Because they use it for some of the same reasons. So this right here is the shell of an animal called a limpet. A limpet is also a univalve, which means it only has one shell, and it moves in its belly, its stomach foot, another gastropod. So it's like a little snail that moves along on the bottom underneath this, and its shell has this oval shape. So you can see the oval shape there and the oval shape hole in the middle. But then they actually kind of come up. They're really kind of thick on the side. You see how they kind of come up like a little pyramid, and then the pyramid just kind of got chopped off? So it's almost like you could make a little triangle shape if you were looking at the side and just chop it off. And that's what a limpet shell looks like. But a live limpet looks a little bit different because their shell gets covered up sometimes by their mantle. So the part that keeps growing. And again, do you see the rings on it? Do you see the growth rings of when it started off and then as it got bigger and bigger? So yeah, it's kind of interesting what we can see as we look at these shells and think about what it looked like when the animal was living in it. This right here is another type of snail. This is a funny looking one. This has a very, very smooth shell. There's no holes in it, but the animal would live down in here, in that long skinny space, and then their little foot would stick out around the edges, and their mantle sometimes covers over the top of them. This is called a cowrie. A chestnut cowrie is the one that we have in this picture. This right here is the mantle. This is the part that's in charge of making the shell bigger and also shining its shell. Do you see how shiny it is? That's all because of this mantle. What the cowrie does is it brings the mantle up over the top of its body, and it helps shine the shell, and it cleans it up, and it can repair it. If it gets any scratches or nicks on it, it can make that shell even shinier and fixed up, and so that's the mantle. And do you see this right down here? Those right there are their two little antennae. So this shows you that this is the head end of this animal. It's moving this way, and then this would be the back side of the animal. But just like with our holes on the abalone, when we were talking about the limpet, they also get all their waste right out the top. It looks like it's coming out the top of their shell. Kind of interesting. So now when you look at a shell next time you go to the beach, I want you to think about the animal that was living inside of it, because that shell does a great job of protecting them. But yet we also know there are predators in the ocean. There are predators at the beach. So even birds love to eat animals that live in these little shells, these little mollusks. And so sometimes you might see them digging in the sand and breaking open and getting those animals out of their shells. But for the most part, these shells do a really great job protecting these animals. Well, I hope you've enjoyed learning about some mollusks with me today as we explore the world of invertebrates, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more another time about some other really interesting invertebrates. There are so many in the ocean, so many cool things to explore, but thank you all for joining us today, and I hope that I didn't miss anything. Oh, there was one question that came in about jellies, and the question was, can jellies sting each other? And yes and no. So anytime something brushes up against those stinging cells in their tentacles, it could fire off a stinging cell, except the jellies might not feel it. So the jellies might not really feel it. They might not notice their stinging cells stinging themselves, because it might be also some of the same sort of chemical signature to them, which is kind of how sea anemones work too. So there's a few different mechanisms that different types of stinging cells can use, but the jellies, they're not really going to feel the pain of it. They don't have the same sort of nerve receptors. So if they sting each other, they don't even know it, which is kind of cool for them. Okay, but great question. Thank you for typing that in. Sorry it took me so long to get around to answering that. But I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. We do have another class coming up in a half hour if you wanted to spend some time exploring the world of mammals a little bit. So have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and I hope you'll join us again for another Aquarium Online Academy. Bye, everyone. Oh, and again, teachers, you can send in your numbers. We'd love to hear how many you had watching. Thank you. Bye.